Next issue, how do we lock the player so that we can't move around and look around while the menu is open? Okay, let's stop the game and just kind of think about that. There's some ways we can test it. Basically, if you were to look at this rigid body FPS controller, the way it works is there are two scripts. There's the rigid body first person controller script here, and if we look at the main camera, I guess there's just this head bob script that we turned off over here. We could even remove it if we wanted. Anyway, so basically the logic, when we run the game and I just hit escape and I get my mouse cursor back, and then if I click in the game window, the mouse cursor hides again, hit escape, I got the cursor, click, cursor goes away. That functionality is actually contained within this script right here. And you could double click that and open it, and you'll see it's just a script in your game. It's part of the standard assets. Remember, we imported that way back when. So you could go search through this for cursor and see where they are adjusting the cursor, which I would have thought was in here. I guess I'm wrong. Let's think about where it might be instead. So I have two ideas about how to find this cursor thing, but I think the best, most straightforward is to just, if you hit Control F and you search cursor like I did, that's only going to search, you can see the current document. But if you hit Control Shift F, you get the super duper find in files, and I can search the entire solution for cursor and find them all. Alternatively, it looked like if I hit Control F, maybe there's another choice here where I can search. Yeah, I can just use that drop down. I don't want to search cur, I want to search cursor. Ooh, that is not, fingers not on home row. All right, cursor, I want to search everything. And I'll just hit search. So I don't like this one actually. It did find what I was looking for, but for the record, I think Control Shift F is better finding files, and I'll show you why, because it allows me to find all, and then I can see all of them here. This is every spot it ever says cursor in my project, and this is just more useful because it helps me find all of the spots. Well, so this is curious to me. I thought I searched for cursor. I guess my search was like not inclusive of, like, it was case sensitive and not, it had to match the complete word. So that's why this wasn't coming up. But anyway, if I see this mouse look script here, this seems to be where locking the cursor is happening. And so that means somewhere out there, there's a mouse look script that I somehow missed when I was searching through all of this. And I see how they've done it here. The mouse look script is actually like a serialized class inside of this rigid body first person controller script, which might sound confusing, but basically you can take a whole class. I can make a serialized field just like we have been and it will take a object of the type mouse look, and that's how you can get it to show up like they did, where this whole other class is showing up contained within this rigid body first person controller script. So I don't know, I can find that. I'm just going to hit regular old Control F and search for mouse look, and you can see how they've done it here. Don't forget that public automatically serializes it. We've just been using serialized field to have a tighter control over our access modifiers, which is good practice. Anyway, if you click on where it says mouse look right here, the name of the class, and you were to hit F12, F12 takes you to the definition. Alternatively, I could right click on it and I can hit go to definition. Super useful function in Visual Studio. So here's this mouse look class, and here's where the lock cursor thing is happening. You can see it in the editor here if it helps. Lock cursor, you can see all these choices are going to match all these choices because this is the script. So let's keep using our fancy Visual Studio hotkey stuff to figure out how they're locking this cursor. So I'm going to assume this does a thing. So I'm just going to right click and choose Find All References so we can figure out every spot they're using this value. Or I could hit Shift F12 and that will also find all of the spots where this is being used. So find all references. It's used in 3 spots. One, right here where we're setting the cursor lock, and you can see how it works. So it just says cursor.lockState equals blah blah blah. So the way they're doing this, they're using this cursor without a reference to it. That shows us that this is a static class. So if we were to actually look this up in the documentation, which there's actually a hotkey for that in Visual Studio too. It's kind of longer. I don't know if I can remember it. Let's see. Let's just look it up real quick. Visual Studio. There's that. This is kind of funny because I actually worked on this documentation and I can't remember the answer, but here it is. In Visual Studio, highlight the spot you want to learn about and press Control-Alt-M, and then after that Control-H. So you can see why I have a hard time remembering that. So these these like combo hotkeys are kind of tricky. So I have to hit Control-Alt-M, and then I let go of everything and I hit Control-H, and that brought up the documentation, and you can see this is a static thing just like we thought. So anyway, that was just a roundabout way of A, figuring out how we can mess with the cursor, and B, figuring out where the cursor is controlled in this existing script. And it's important to understand that because if I were to write some of my own code that's going to control the cursor, I'm going to go back to my find results. Or no, I'm sorry, the lock cursor search results here. If I were to write my own code that messed with this stuff, it's going to sort of be in conflict with whatever this script is doing. I'd have 2 scripts sort of fighting over control of what happens to the cursor. And so that's not a good thing. So my choices are either modify this script so that it plays nicely with what I want to do with my inventory menu, or alternatively, I could turn this script off whenever I'm using my inventory menu and then turn it back on when I'm done with my inventory menu. And that's actually a better solution, I think, because we need to disable the player from walking around and looking around anyhow. So in my script, whenever I show the menu, I need to disable this, I need to disable the rigid body FPS character controller here, which is going, this thing contains that mouse look thing. I can find that again. This class contains an instance of that mouse look here. And so that will sort of take care of 2 birds with 1 stone. It'll stop my player from looking around, and moving around. And we'll also stop this script from interfering with whatever logic I want to apply to the cursor. So what that means is in our inventory menu script, we need a reference to something of the type rigid body first person controller. So if I were to copy the name of this class and go back to the inventory menu and try to make a variable of that type, I could say private this thing and then give it a name like lowercase. You'll see that it's underlined in red, and that is because this class exists within a namespace. And a namespace is just another way, it's a way to organize your scripts or your classes so that you can see what Unity did was they made all of the standard assets stuff exist within the standard assets namespace. And you can see this particular class exists in the standard assets.characters.firstperson namespace. So long story short, all I gotta do here is use the quick fix hotkey control period, add a using statement right there, and that way I can use this class and recognize this class without having to type in this whole big long prefix, this is what you call the fully qualified name. So if I did something like that, this is the fully qualified name. But that's like rather a lot to type. So that's why we have these using statements, which allows us to not type the first huge part of that fully qualified name. So we don't have to type the namespace every time this way since we have the using statement. Okay, so now I have a private variable of the type this. And in case you're confused or want a quick overview of our goal here, essentially what I'm going to do is try and get a reference to that script right here. This is the script on my player, essentially. And I need to, I believe, just kind of uncheck this, would essentially do what I want to do. And we could test it out. So if I hit, in order to test this, I need to not have maximize on play selected because I need to be able to still see my inspector. So I'm going to hit the play button. I'm going to press tab to get my menu. Then I'm going to press escape just so I can click over on my inspector stuff. And I'm going to see what happens when I uncheck that. And now you can see I can still use my menu, but I cannot walk around and look around. And then when I recheck this, I can walk around and look around. So basically when I bring up my menu, I need to uncheck this, and when I dismiss my menu, I need to recheck that. And that's just as simple as enabling or disabling a component of this type. So I gotta get a reference to that component on that game object, that specific one. Now the neat thing is I could just make this a serialized field and drag it in there, but I'm just going to use this as an excuse to show you another way of doing this. I can't use getComponent because there is no rigid body first person controller component on the inventory menu game object, so that would find nothing. However, I do know that there's only one of these in my game, and that's maybe not always true. Like if you're working on a multiplayer game, you wouldn't be able to do what I'm about to do. But in this particular game, I know that it's a single player game. So in Awake, when I'm initializing all this other stuff, I'm going to also initialize this rigid body first person character controller variable I made. So this is the lowercase one. This is my particular instance of it. So I'm going to say that equals find object of type. Is that what I'm going to do? find object of type, and it's going to be rigid body first person controller. So this will search the whole scene for something of this type and store it in there. So again, couldn't get away with this if there's more than one, because we will be unclear which one we would find and if it was the right one. But since I know there's only exactly one object of this type in my scene, this is a nifty way to do it that basically makes sure that the designer can't mess this up. Like if I were to make it a serialized field, there's a chance they forget to plug it in, or they plug in the wrong thing or something like that. Okay, I also think it's going to be very important that we do this before we do this. And so I think maybe what makes sense is to just, I'm going to control X hide menu out of my awake, and I'm going to go back and add a start function. And the reason is start gets called after awake, and that way there's just no way I can accidentally like call hide menu before any of this important initialization stuff. So in summary, you want to make sure you initialize all your stuff before you start using it. And so that's why it can be good to do this kind of like component initialization work in awake, and then do things that need to happen at the beginning after all the initialization is done in start. So that's my logic for moving this into start, just to make sure this doesn't happen until after all this stuff. Because hide menu is going to need to enable the character controller, right? So I'm going to hit F12 while I have hide menu selected. That'll bring me up to it. Show definition of that method. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and say rigid body first person controller with a lowercase r dot enabled equals true. Needs to be true. And when I show the menu right here, I'm going to do the opposite. So I'm going to just select this line, go up here and paste it in. And I'm going to say that when you show the menu, the character controller needs to not be enabled. So saving this and testing it out ought to get me sorta to where I need to be. You'll see, so I should be able to play normally when the game starts. Hit tab, can't walk around. You'd almost think the game is frozen, actually. The last step will be adding my custom cursor functionality here, which I can't, it's not going to be easy to do without, I can't do it with this thing turned on because this thing overwrites my custom cursor functionality. But the cool part is you can see that's getting unchecked when my menu is visible. So that will open the door for me to write new custom code for handling whether or not you can see the cursor. So that's the next step. Alright, so let's stop the game here. And so locking the cursor is essentially a two-step process. What we need to do is find our show menu and hide menu. So when we show the menu, we need to unlock the cursor so that if the menu is visible, I need to be able to see and move the cursor. So it's important that we do this stuff after we've turned off this code that is also messing with the cursor. So go ahead and make sure that you do this after we've disabled the rigid body first person controller. And what we're going to do is use the Oops, I have caps lock on there. We're going to use this cursor static class here, and we're going to say that the cursor needs to be visible, right? So cursor visible equals true, and we need to unlock the cursor as well. So the way to do that is cursor dot lock state equals, and you should, if you're using Visual Studio, it should automatically take you to this cursor lock mode enumeration. We haven't really talked about enumerations much, but one of the things they're useful for is sort of defining a limited set of options. So once because the lock state is of the type cursor lock state, it's of the type cursor lock mode, that means I can only use options in this cursor lock mode enumeration, which just kind of gives me a limited subset of options here that there's no way to mess up. Like I can't type in, something that's not a choice here. If I did, it won't compile. Anyway, we want to just go ahead and choose none. So this way, when we show the menu, the cursor is visible and unlocked. Now, alternatively, when we hide the menu, we need to do the opposite. So I'm going to go ahead and copy those two lines. I'm going to go into my hide menu method. When we hide the menu, actually, in this case, we actually want to make sure that we do our cursor stuff before we turn this back on. Because once we turn this back on, it's going to do its own cursor stuff. So anyway, when we hide the menu, we want to hide the cursor. So cursor visible is false. And for this lock mode, we want to choose locked. In which locked just keeps it stuck in the center of the screen. And I don't know whether or not that's important for this thing to work, but I know that that is what it does on its own. So I'm just going to set it all back up how this class expects it to be before I turn this thing back on. So again, the order of these three lines is important. So inside of the show menu, you need to make sure you disable the FPS controller before doing the cursor stuff. And then in the hide menu, you have to make sure that you do the cursor stuff before turning on the FPS controller again. Alright, so let's save this and give it a shot. See if everything's working the way we expect. And I'll run the game. So cursor's all there. Or I mean the opposite of that. Cursor's locked and invisible. I hit the inventory button and I have my cursor. If I hit the inventory button again, cursor's gone. Cool. This is working.